So I'm going to talk about democracy, but in the African context. I'm going to talk about Jerry John Rawlings. Okay, first, this is in the Republic of Ghana in West Africa. You can see it located there on this handy map that I got off of royalty-free images. Okay, fast forward. If we want to go Ghana, West Africa has all kinds of connections to the Atlantic world throughout world history. This is Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first prime minister, which had the distinction of living in the United States for over a decade. And he was inspired by a lot of political movements he saw in the United States, particularly the idea of Pan-Africanism, the idea that Africa should be a federal republic that would rise up against European imperialism and sort of challenge like white supremacy on the world stage. Nkrumah led Ghana to independence after returning from the United States. And so for fun fact, his connections to Harlem, if you look at that black star in the middle of Ghana's flag, that's a tribute to Marcus Garvey, who actually in Harlem sort of created the idea of Africa being a single republic, right? So Nkrumah had a tribute to him. Nkrumah, of course, in challenging Western rule, led him to be a socialist and later communist, which led him directly into the global politics of the Cold War, which made him not only sort of, Ghana became independent in 1957, most African countries became independent in the 1960s and the 70s, so he went from the vanguard of African freedom to being thrust directly into the Cold War. He went from friends to the United States to directly coming into confrontation with them, especially after the United States funded the assassination of Congolese Prime Minister and Nkrumah protege Patrice Lumumba in the 60s. And what you'll see is that the further Nkrumah went to the left, elements of Ghanaian society that didn't agree with him going to the left and also didn't like himself declaring the country a single-party state and himself president for life, Ghana goes into a period of political instability where leaders from either the left or the right in the military seeking assistance from the Soviet Union or the United States take over because civilian governments are weak, which kind of leads us here to Jerry John Rawlings, this charismatic-looking gentleman down here. By the time Jerry Rawlings takes over, though, there is no Soviet Union really to go to, right? By the time you're getting to the late 80s, America is emerging as the preeminent global power. Here you go. You have the Berlin Wall falling, and then you have George Bush declaring that there's a new world order, right, that the United States can declare war in Iraq without any sort of, or take a military action in Iraq without any challenge from the Soviet Union that's crumbling. So what did the end of the Cold War mean for Africa? So the IMF and the World Bank are the only games left in town. This is before China rises as the world's second largest economy, right? So African leaders can't borrow from the Soviet Union anymore. And they made structural adjustment economic policies and holding free and fair elections conditions for borrowing. American leaders and European leaders all of a sudden had no use for dictatorships in Africa, so they were like, now you can have human rights with a little bit of capitalism as a treat. So African leaders that may have had all kinds of different political programs had to abandon them and become good Western neoliberal capitalists. Jerry Rawlings talks about this in this documentary clip where he's doing an interview with Diane Sawyer.
Africa finds herself in a catch-22 situation, you see. She better watch what she says here and there, or else you don't get that aid or that assistance, etc., etc. What kind of blackmail is this? But this is another fact of the things you people don't know and don't see. And it's a painful thing for me sitting here to have to be making such admissions. But these are some of the truths, the hard facts, my dear.
So that means Africa had to adopt neoliberalism. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Neoliberalism is not liberalism. It is actually conservatism. To basically sort of shrink it down, if you wanted to associate who created neoliberal ideology on the world stage, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. That's right. Neoliberalism is actually conservatism, the idea that the free market is the solution to all of the world's problems. And you saw a lot of political scientists make this proclaimment at the end of the Cold War. I don't know if you've ever heard of Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama. He said that the end of the Cold War marked the end of history, that we were on a steady march towards capitalism and democracy, something that the last 10 years of world history have not supported at all. So what did African leaders like Jerry Rawlings have to do? Why did he call having to go to the IMF and the World Bank blackmail? Because he was actually inspired by dependency theory that said that African countries were made dependent on the West. But by the time he comes to power, it's the only game left in town. So you had to clean up your public finances by reducing government spending. You had to cut public sector employment. You had to devalue your currency. Trade liberalization, you had to reduce your tariffs and open up your economy to the world. And then you had to privatize public enterprises, right? All those fun state companies that Nkrumah set up under his socialist government, you have to sell those off. So a good example would be Ghana Telecom became Vodafone for only $800 million. And if you know anything about the telecom boom in Africa, that ended up being like basement prices for the state company. So what were the results, right? Yeah, public education deteriorates, right? Because you have to like introduce school fees rather than taxing people for education, right? Instead of expanding your health infrastructure, this is a bad time for Africa, right? 1980s, if you're cutting your budget for healthcare spending, HIV/AIDS is getting ready to hit, so this is gonna like form a perfect storm for African countries, right? And then instead of making economies grow fast, most African economies actually stalled. And then what you see is economic inequality enter into Africa. You can trace directly to the 80s and the 90s. These economic reforms lead to like this growth of this African 1% that you're kind of like starting to see. So the divide between the rich and the poor gets much, much larger with the cuts to social programs. So if you wanted to think, as a political scientist, what is the physical representation of structural adjustment? One is, look at this cool revolutionary with his aviators.
Very cool.
Yeah. But then look at this cool democratic neoliberal with his nice business suit with Bill Clinton applauding. Yeah, Ghana goes from a country that's courting the Soviet Union to becoming the darling of the Western world. Aid money starts flowing in, and Ghana actually is the only country that would be visited by, African country that was visited by consecutive American presidents except for Donald Trump. I wonder why Donald Trump did not go to Africa. Fun story about this, Bill Clinton on his official state visit refused to take off his wool suit to show his bare shoulder in 90-degree Ghanaian weather. So he put his kente cloth over it and nearly passed out during his speech. Okay, so the idea is that democracy would rejuvenate civil society, right? That by democracy, all the groups that military dictatorships had shut out, like such as like your journalists, your churches, your trade unions, all of those people would get back involved in society. Here's a fun chart showing you like the way civil society is supposed to work. Lawyers, all those things, even like big companies get a say, right? Some democracy cons. Some African leaders were actually against democracy in Africa. Some examples would be like countries that have too many political parties. For instance, does anybody pay attention to South African politics? It's the weirdest thing I've ever said as a comic on stage. Y'all check out South African politics. If you go back to the transition to democracy in South Africa, you'll see Nelson Mandela and then 75 other parties. It means the ANC has never lost in elections, which if you want to look it up, there's a guy named Jacob Zuma. He is the African Donald Trump. He destroys the country's economy. He's a complete buffoon and those things, but he didn't lose because he was part of the dominant party. So that's one argument that people made against too many political parties. Then political parties can be vehicles for ethnic conflict, especially when people from different regions vote for like the same party, right? So Kenya's had like instances of election violence. And then some people say democracy doesn't lend itself to fast government action. As someone like Jerry Rawlings said, I am not communist nor capitalist, but I know what it means to be hungry, right? So that was his justification for his early dictatorship. And democracy might be more of an imposition than an organic reflection of people's desires, right? A lot of people in Africa, as you've seen, as people turn away from democracy, they go, it was cool being able to vote, but we can't eat that, right? So democracy cons. Pros, actually, they generally allow for constitutional rights, like free speech and the press and assembly is very nice. They allow minority groups to have a voice in government, even if it's a minority party, right? In South Africa, there's a party for everything. Like, there are actually still, like, I am a white racist that didn't leave from apartheid, and I have a political party. My name is Steve. You can see that on a South African ballot. Separation of powers is great, term limits are great, and the rule of law provides pathways to fight corruption. So look, Jerry Rawlings is actually part of a huge shift towards democracy in Africa. Check out how it corresponds directly towards the ending of the Cold War. Tons of countries going from autocracies and dictatorships into something either free and fair democracies or democracies that are quote unquote free and fair. And Ghana today remains a two-party democracy. This is from the recent election, and as you can see, even though you have like a balance between the two parties, and Ghana has actually become a model of capitalism and democracy across Africa, which is the reason why even recently like Barack Obama visited the country. So if you want to read more about Ghana's transition and about how all of these things also led to the creation of the most viable African-American tourist market, where you can see African-Americans going to Ghana, and you can tell that they're the African-Americans because they have the African clothing on. While the Africans have a Manchester United jersey and Nikes on. You can check out my book, Pan-Africanism in Ghana, on the internet.